Welcome to the Neutral Ground. This week we're going to take a deep dive, pun intended, into one of the most complex, most intellectually interesting, most philosophically interesting characters in all of American literature, Captain Ahab, from Herman Melville's classic Moby-Dick. Now, there are many pop cultural references to Moby-Dick, and the basic story seems to be fairly accurate in terms of how it's depicted. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But there is so much depth to the character, to the story, that we're actually going to just focus in, believe it or not, on one particular chapter from the novel, chapter 132, titled The Symphony. And my hope is today that we walk away with a better understanding for why we seem so compelled at times to chase something to our own destruction. Because I do think that that's something that we're doing quite a bit more of today. And maybe we can talk a little bit more about that as well at the end. What I want to do first is I want to give a little bit of background information here to kind of set the stage for how Moby-Dick comes about. So it's published in 1851, but Melville didn't just kind of come out of nowhere and write this whaling novel. He actually has real life experience. Back in 1841, he signs up to be on a whaling ship called the Acushnet, and he's on the Acushnet for about a year and a half before he deserts it in a rather almost action hero kind of way. Stay with me. The story gets quite interesting. So he deserts the ship, and he ends up on an island in what we would call the Marquesa Islands or French Polynesia today. He ends up on an island with cannibals. And this is where he would later kind of get the name, the man who lived among the cannibals. Well, he's able to leave the island, and he signs up for another whaling ship called the Lucienne, where he finds himself embroiled in a mutiny aboard the ship. He ends up leaving that ship and is dropped off in Tahiti, where he signs up for his third and final whaling voyage on the Charles and Henry. And on this whaling voyage, what's interesting about it is that he's actually a very young harpooner. And I've got my replica harpoon here that I got from my wonderful, amazing wife. So if you're watching on the YouTube channel, you can see this, or on Spotify, you see the video as well. Here's my wonderful replica harpoon. And this is basically what they would throw, right? They'd launch this out for the whales, to get the whales, because at the time, of course, whaling was the source of a lot of different resources. Okay, so he's finished whaling, and he starts his writing career. There's stuff that happens in between, but I'm going to fast forward a little bit here. His first two novels, Taipi and Omu, basically come right out of his adventures, his real adventures, with some, modifications for entertainment purposes. But I encourage you to read those novels. They're incredibly entertaining, incredibly entertaining. He writes those two. They're pretty successful, quite honestly. And then he comes out with his third novel, Marty, which is basically a philosophical tome. I mean, it is incredibly dense and not unreadable. I actually enjoy it a lot. I like it. But for many people, it's just a little bit too philosophically dense. After that, he writes two more novels, Redburn and White Jacket, which are much more readable and enjoyable as well, especially Redburn. Redburn's a very quick read, but wonderful. And then 1851 comes around, and he publishes his magnum opus, Moby-Dick. So that's how we get here today. So there's quite a pathway of experience that leads up to Melville writing this wonderful novel. In terms of the pop cultural representations that come out of Moby-Dick, for the most part, they're pretty accurate. It is the story of a monomaniacal captain who is hell-bent on chasing and killing a white whale, or actually, really, it's only part of it is actually white. That's kind of one of the little secrets here. But the white whale known as Moby-Dick. What they don't tell you, however, is how Ahab gets to that point, really. Yes, sometimes they'll talk about that Moby-Dick took his leg, but there are psychological and philosophical ramifications that also encourage, or compel is probably the better word, compel Ahab to need to chase Moby-Dick and need to, at the same time, bring war upon God, because that is, I think, still a major theme of the novel, is Ahab's compulsion to bring war upon God. So here's what I'm going to do, because we're going to bring in, later on, we're going to really break down this chapter 132, the Symphony. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read the chapter in its fully, because it's not particularly long, but it is so beautiful. And I think to get the real sense of what Ahab is going through here, you have to hear all the different turns that happen in this novel. If for whatever reason you don't want to hear me read this chapter, if you're on the YouTube channel, you can just skip to the next part here. If not, then fast forward a little bit. Probably won't take me too long. Fast forward a little bit and we'll start breaking down the chapter. But I encourage you to listen, if for no other reason than to get a refresher maybe on what's going on in this chapter. So let me get my trusty Moby-Dick here. And I'm going to start reading. It was a clear steel-blue day. The firmaments of air and sea were hardly separable in that all-pervading azure. Only the pensive air was transparently pure and soft, with a woman's look, and the robust and manlike sea heaved with long, strong, lingering swells as Samson's chest in his sleep. Hither and thither on high glided the snow-white wings of small, unspeckled birds. These were the gentle thoughts of the feminine air. But to and fro in the deeps, far down in the bottomless blue, rushed mighty leviathans, swordfish, and sharks, and these were the strong, troubled, murderous thinkings of the masculine sea. But though thus contrasting within, the contrast was only in shades and shadows without. Those two seemed one. It was only the sex, as it were, that distinguished them. Aloft like a royal czar and king, the sun seemed giving this gentle air to this bold and rolling sea, even as bride to groom. And at the girdling line of the horizon, a soft and tremulous motion, most seen here at the equator, denoted the fond, throbbing trust, the loving alarms, with which the poor bride gave her bosom away. Tied up and twisted, gnarled and knotted with wrinkles, haggardly firm and unyielding, his eyes glowing like coals that still glow in the ashes of ruin. Untottering, Ahab stood forth in the clearness of the morn, lifting his splintered helmet of a brow to the fair girl's forehead of heaven. O immortal infancy and innocency of the azure, invisible winged creatures that frolic all around us, sweet childhood of air and sky, how oblivious were ye of old Ahab's close-coiled woe! But so have I seen little Miriam and Martha, laughing-eyed elves, heedlessly gambol around their old sire, sporting with the circle of singed locks which grew on the marge of that burnt-out crater of his brain. Slowly crossing the deck from the scuttle, Ahab leaned over the side and watched how his shadow in the water sank and sank to his gaze, the more and the more that he strove to pierce the profundity. But the lovely aromas in that enchanted air did at last seem to dispel, for a moment, the cankerous thing in his soul. That glad, happy air, that winsome sky did at last stroke and caress him. The stepmother world, so long cruel, forbidding, now threw affectionate arms round his stubborn neck, and did seem to joyously sob over him, as if over one that however wilful and erring, she could yet find it in her heart to save and to bless. From beneath his slouched hat, Ahab dropped a tear into the sea. Nor did all the Pacific contain such wealth as that one wee drop. Starbuck saw the old man, saw him, how he heavily leaned over the side, and he seemed to hear in his own true heart the measureless sobbing that stole out of the center of the serenity around. Careful not to touch him or be noticed by him, he yet drew near to him and stood there. Ahab turned. "Starbuck." "Sir?" "Oh, Starbuck. It is a mild, mild wind, and a mild-looking sky. On such a day, very much such a sweetness as this, I struck my first whale, a boy harpooner of 18, 40 years ago. 40 years of continual whaling, 40 years of privation and peril and storm time, 40 years on the pitiless sea. For 40 years has Ahab forsaken the peaceful land, for 40 years to make war on the horrors of the deep. Aye, and yes, Starbuck, out of those 40 years I have not spent 3 ashore. When I think of this life I have led, the desolation of solitude it has been, the masoned, walled town of a captain's exclusiveness, which admits but small entrance to any sympathy from the green country without, oh, weariness, heaviness, Guinea Coast slavery of solitary command. When I think of all this, only half suspected, not so keenly known to me before, and how for 40 years I have fed upon dry salted fare, fit emblem of the dry nourishment of my soul. When the poorest landsman has had fresh fruit to his daily hand, and broken the world's fresh bread to my mouldy crusts. Away, whole oceans away from that young girl wife I wedded past 50, and sailed for Cape Horn the next day, leaving but one dent in my marriage pillow. Wife? Rather a widow, with her husband alive. Aye, I widowed that poor girl when I married her, Starbuck. And then the madness, the frenzy, the boiling blood, and the smoking brow with which for 1,000 lowerings old Ahab has furiously, foamingly chased his prey, more a demon than a man. Aye, what a 40 years fool! Old fool, has old Ahab been. Why this strife of the chase? Why weary and palsy the arm at the oar, and the iron, and the lance? How the richer or better is Ahab now? Behold, O Starbuck, is it not hard that with this weary load I bear, one poor leg should have been snatched from under me? Here, brush this old hair aside. It blinds me that I seem to weep. Locks so grey did never grow but from out some ashes. But do I look very old? So very, very old, Starbuck? I feel deadly faint, bowed and humped as though I were Adam, staggering beneath the piled centuries since paradise. God! Crack my heart! Stave my brain! Mockery! Bitter-biting mockery of grey hairs! Have I lived enough joy to wear ye, and seem and feel thus intolerably old? Close. Stand close to me, Starbuck. Let me look into a human eye. It is better than to gaze into sea or sky, better than to gaze upon God. By the green land, by the bright hearthstone, this is the magic glass, man. I see my wife and my child in thine eye. No, stay on board, lower not when I do, when branded Ahab gives chase to Moby-Dick. That hazard shall not be thine. No, not with the faraway home I see in that eye. Oh, my captain, noble soul, grand old heart after all. Why should anyone give chase to that hated fish? Away with me! Let us fly these deadly waters! Let us home! Wife and child, too, are Starbuck's, wife and child of his brotherly, sisterly, playfellow youth. Even as thine, sir, are the wife and child of thy loving, longing, paternal old age. Away! Let us away! This instant let me alter the course. How cheerily, how hilariously, oh, my captain, would we bowl on our way to see old Nantucket again! I think, sir, they have some such blue, mild days even as this in Nantucket. They have. They have. I have seen them. Some summer days in the morning. About this time, yes, it is his noon nap now. The boy vivaciously wakes, sits up in bed, and his mother tells him of me, of cannibal old me, how I am abroad upon the deep, but will yet come back to dance him again. 'Tis my Mary herself. She promised that my boy every morning should be carried to the hill to catch the first glimpse of his father's sail. Yes, no more. It is done. We head for Nantucket. Come, my captain, study out the course, and let us away. See the boy's face from the window? The boy's hand on the hill. But Ahab's glance was averted. Like a blighted fruit tree he shook, and cast his last cindered apple to the soil. What is it? What nameless, inscrutable, unearthly thing is it? What cozening hidden lord and master and cruel, remorseless emperor commands me that against all natural lovings and longings I so keep pushing and crowding and jamming myself on all the time, recklessly making me ready to do what in my own proper natural heart I durst not so much as dare? Is Ahab? Is it I, God, or who, that lifts this arm? But if the great sun move not of himself, but is an errand boy in heaven, nor one single star can revolve but by some invisible power, how then can this one small heart beat? This one small brain think thoughts? Unless God does that beating, does that thinking, does that living, and not I. By heaven, man, we are turned round and round in this world, like yonder windlass, and fate is the handspike. And all the time, lo, that smiling sky, in this unsounded sea. Look, see yon albacore? Who put it into him to chase and fang that flying fish? Where do murderers go, man? Who's to doom when the judge himself is dragged to the bar? But it is a mild wind, and a mild-looking sky, and the air smells now as if it blew from a far-away meadow. They have been making hay somewhere under the slopes of the Andes, Starbuck, and the mowers are sleeping among the new-mown hay. Sleeping, aye, toil we, as we may, we all sleep at last on the field. Sleep, aye, and rust, amid greenness, as last year's scythes flung down and left in the half-cut swaths, Starbuck. But blanched to a corpse's hue with despair, the mate had stolen away. Ahab crossed the deck to gaze over on the other side, but started at two reflected fixed eyes in the water there. Fedallah was motionlessly leaning over the same rail. All right, so let's start breaking down this chapter here, and I actually want to focus on three particular parts here. I want to first look at the kind of gendering of the air and the sea. We'll talk about that. Then I want to talk about this idea of Ahab and his shadow in the water and trying to pierce the profundity. What does that mean? Well, how is Ahab thinking about that concept? And then finally, I want to talk, of course, about Ahab's struggle with agency, right? Is Ahab Ahab? And is it I or God or who that lifts this arm? We'll talk about that. So let's begin by taking a closer look at this idea of differentiating and gendering the air and the sea and what that might mean in terms of what Melville is thinking here. So first, let me bring us back to that section here. It says, hither and thither on high, glided the snow-white wings of small unspeckled birds. These were the gentle thoughts of the feminine air. But to and fro in the deeps, far down in the bottomless blue, rushed mighty leviathans, swordfish and sharks. These were the strong, troubled, murderous thinkings of the masculine sea. So he differentiates the two. So we know that we're supposed to do that ourselves. But then Melville adds this element to it. He says, though thus contrasting within, the contrast was only in shades and shadows. Without, those two seemed one. It was only the sex that differentiated them. And that's the key element here, right? So in order for us to, I think, make a little more sense of what's going on, you have to understand Melville's keen awareness of the Bible, specifically Melville's understanding of the abject lineage of the Old Testament. Now, what do I mean by that? Here's what I mean. You have this repetition in the Bible, and it's really throughout Old, and you can find it even to a degree in New Testament as well, but Old Testament mostly. This repetition of two sons being born, one being chosen for the birthright, right, the chosen birthright, and the other in a kind of state of exile, a type of exile. Melville was very much sensitive to those abject sons who were not chosen, not beloved in the same way as their brother. So, for example, first and foremost, you've got Cain and Abel, right? And it's not that Melville thinks that Cain is wonderful and didn't, and it was a not a bad thing that he murdered his brother. Of course, it was terrible. But Cain is exiled, and Cain forever is marked, just like Ahab, right? He mentions in this paragraph here, or this chapter, the splintered brow. Ahab has a scar running down his body, right, from head all the way down. What we're going to see here is that Ahab is going to be a kind of abject son as well. But if you know anything about the Bible, it's actually quite more complex than this. So Cain is exiled, right? Then you have the story of Isaac and Ishmael. And Isaac and Ishmael are the sons of Abraham, but Ishmael is not the son of Sarah, Abraham's wife. Sarah, you might recall, wants a child, sends Hagar into Abraham's tent where they conceive Ishmael. But then Sarah does conceive a son, Isaac. And when Sarah no longer wants Ishmael to share in Isaac's birthright, she decrees that that both Hagar, the mother, and Isaac should be exiled and sent away. That happens, right? And Ishmael is actually given quite a kingdom for himself that will come in handy with Esau later on. And that brings us into the third significant story of the abject son, which is Jacob and Esau. So the story of Jacob and Esau, you can kind of it begins with a biblical prophecy, but the real story between the two begins with the idea of selling of the birthright. So Esau comes back from a hunt. He is starving. He tells his brother Jacob, please give me some food. I'm starving. And Jacob says, sell me your birthright for this pot of lentils. And Esau does just that. He says, okay, what good will my birthright do me if I starve to death? So he sells it. Now, on the surface, of course, that sounds like a terrible brother. Jacob sounds like a terrible brother. From a purely theological standpoint, however, the question is not so much how could Jacob not give his brother food. The theological concern is more how can Esau sell his birthright for just food? And I know that might seem problematic, but that's really kind of the theological question here. Melville was raised in a Dutch Reformed church, which is basically Calvinistic. So when we turn to the Institutes of the Christian Religion by John Calvin, we get a kind of sense of these abject figures and their relationship to the mothers, because the mothers in these, most notably Sarah, Rebecca, and then Rachel, really, what you learn is that the matriarchs in these communities tend to have a tremendous amount of power, right? Because it's, even though I said Sarah basically initiates the idea that Ishmael and Hagar need to be sent away. Never forget that God, of course, goes along with this, right? God is sort of in line, if you will, as stupid as that might sound. God is very much in line with these matriarchs early on. When we look at what Calvin says here, let me go to it here. I've got it marked out. Listen to what Calvin writes about Sarah and Rebecca specifically, right? The mothers of Isaac and Ishmael, and then Jacob and Esau. Calvin writes, "Here, however, a question might be raised as to the view to be taken of Sarah and Rebecca, both of whom, impelled as it would seem by zeal for the faith, went beyond the limits of the word." He's kind of taking them to task a little bit here. "Sarah, in her eager desire for the promised seed, gave her maid to her husband," that's Hagar. "That she sinned in many respects is not to be denied." So Calvin is okay with us, saying, look, this is sinful, what Sarah does here. "But the only fault to which I now refer is her being carried away by zeal." That's the turn. This is where Calvin is going to start to unite these matriarchal figures with God's will, with the providence. "And not confining herself within the limits prescribed by the word. It is certain, however, that her desire proceeded from faith. Rebecca, again, divinely informed of the election of her son Jacob, procures the blessing for him by a wicked stratagem." So what does that mean? When Isaac, her husband, Rebecca's husband, gets older, he loses his sight. And one way that he's able to differentiate between Esau and Jacob is that Esau is a hairy man. So he can touch Esau's skin, feel the hair, and he knows that he's speaking to Esau. Isaac wants to bless Esau, actually, with the paternal birthright blessing. But Rebecca wants Jacob to receive it. And so Isaac says to Esau, "Go hunt, go find venison, make me a wonderful meal, come back, give it to me, and then I will give you your blessing." So what Rebecca decides, the stratagem that Calvin is talking about here, is Rebecca essentially cooks the meal for Jacob and then has Jacob put something on to kind of make it seem like he's hairy. And so when Jacob goes into the tent where Isaac is, Jacob gives him the meal, and then Isaac feels Jacob and gets this kind of faux fur feeling, and then gives the paternal birthright blessing to Jacob. And Esau later comes in and is like, "What? What just happened? How did I miss this?" So that's the stratagem here that Calvin is talking about. Rebecca, again, divinely informed of the election of her son Jacob, procures the blessing for him by a wicked stratagem, deceives her husband, who was a witness and minister of divine grace, forces her son to lie by various frauds and impostures, corrupts divine truth. Let me tell you something. Calvin does not say that lightly, that Rebecca here corrupts divine truth. In fine, by exposing his promise to scorn, does what in her lies to make it of no effect. An odd line. It's almost as if Calvin is saying here, she almost ruins this idea of the blessing. And yet this conduct, here's the turn, and yet this conduct, however vicious and reprehensible, was not devoid of faith. So Calvin here is able to take these matriarchal figures who have these other sons or help one son and not the other, Calvin finds a way to make it be about God's will and about their faith. It's just the strategies that they use is wrong. What Melville, however, sees in this, Melville can only feel complete and utter pity for these other abject sons, for people like Ishmael, for Cain even to a degree, and for Esau, for what they go through in this, for this feeling of being so consciously unloved. How do I know, or how do I suspect that Melville has this in mind? Look at the language that he uses here in the text. Let me get there. That glad, happy air, that winsome sky did at last stroke and caress him, the stepmother world, so long cruel, forbidding, now threw affectionate arms round his stubborn neck and did seem to joyously sob over him, as if over one that however willful and erring, she could yet find it in her heart to save and to bless. I think what Melville is doing here is he's trying to show that there are pathways to bringing someone back from the brink of pure self-destruction. And one of those pathways for Ahab is for the mother figure who seemed so cruel and forbidding for so long, the mother figure to come back and throw her arms around her son and say, I love you, I forgive you for the transgression. In this case, it would be like Cain. I forbid you, come back to the fold in pure love. Why else might this be the case that Melville is thinking about it this way? In chapter 128, just a few chapters before this one, you have a chapter entitled The Pequod Meets the Rachel. The Rachel is a ship in Moby-Dick looking for, or with a captain, I should say, who's looking for a lost son. And it's the Rachel who comes at the end of the novel to pick up who? Ishmael. Remember, probably the most famous line in Moby-Dick is the narrator saying, call me Ishmael. Ishmael is the one who's narrating all of this. And of the three abject sons in that early part of Genesis, it is Ishmael who's probably the best off, right? Because when Hagar and Ishmael are exiled, God is very much aware that something is going on here that's not quite right. Even though he goes along with Sarah's decree that they should be exiled and separated out from Isaac's part of the lineage, God talks to Hagar and essentially says, why are you crying? I will make a great kingdom for your son. So Ishmael is probably the best off of the three, of Cain, Ishmael, and Esau. But that doesn't change the fact that he was cast aside by a mother figure, a stepmother figure in Sarah. So you've got the heir here that is trying to pull Ahab back to the motherly world through love. But then you have also this masculine, murderous thinking C. And what is that about? Well, these maternal figures, these matriarchs, can do nothing without the approval of God, of Yahweh, of the Father. And what is the job of the God, right? Whether it's God, Yahweh, or whether it's even Jesus, what do they tend to do? They tend to impose order on the chaos. And where do we see chaos most? We see chaos at the point of creation, right? You can read about gods even in the Greek tradition and even in the Native American tradition, I believe, where these gods create humanity or earth out of the void, out of chaos. In the New Testament, of course, you have Jesus on the boat with the apostles, and what does he do? He quiets the water. He quiets the chaos of nature that is happening all around them. The murderous thinkings here, and of course, it's no coincidence that Melville mentions leviathans in the sea here, because one of the books that Melville read the most in the Old Testament was the book of Job. And in the book of Job, it's all about God telling Job, look, can you do everything that I do? No, you cannot understand the ways of me. Canst thou hook the Leviathan? So, underneath the sea, you've got the world of the Father, who is managing all of this chaos. But on the surface, it might be perfectly calm, right? We get to see the surface layer of these things, but underneath, we've got God's providence, God's working, his thinking, trying to manage all the chaos here, trying to deal with the monsters of the deep. Now, what is Ahab doing, of course, in his pursuit here? He is trying to impose his own order on the chaos, on the monsters, right? He says, for 40 years battling the monsters of the deep. He considers himself even, and some people have made an interesting argument here about Ahab as a kind of heroic figure doing battle with the serpents and doing battle with the monsters of the deep. I think it's a fun thing to think about, but I'm not sure you get so far with that thought that he's heroic. I'm not so sure. Maybe someone can make a better argument for it. Nonetheless, the duality here that I see is the stepmother world trying to bring him back in, and the masculine world of the father trying to tell him, stay on the surface. Just stay right there. Don't come down here. Down here is nothing but destruction, right? Let me bring in, this is probably a good place to start bringing in some Jung here as well. I've got my Answer to Job by cgjung. And let me get to the right spot here. So just to pull this all together, I think what Melville understood really well is that these patterns that you saw in the Bible of the strife of the son who felt as though he were outcast and just simply not loved, Jung saw this too, and he saw this as a pattern that would reoccur constantly. Look at what he wrote here in his Answer to Job. What exists in the pleroma, meaning like the totality of the divine powers, what exists in the pleroma as an eternal process appears in time as an aperiodic sequence. That is to say, it is repeated many times in an irregular pattern. The repetition of these dueling suns at war, in a sense. To take but one example, Yahweh had one good son and one who was a failure. Cain and Abel, Jacob and Esau, correspond to this prototype. And so, in all ages and in all parts of the world, does the motif of the hostile brothers, which in innumerable modern variants still causes dissension in families, and keeps the psychotherapist busy. So Jung even talks about the importance of this idea. And Melville had brothers himself. And he went through a tremendous amount of strife, Melville, as well. So Melville was keenly aware of this hostility that could happen between brothers as well. All right. The second thing I want to look at here, in addition to that, is this notion of piercing the profundity. So let me read that line, and then we can break it down even a little bit more here. Slowly crossing the deck from the scuttle, Ahab leaned over the side and watched how his shadow in the water sank and sank to his gaze, the more and the more that he strove to pierce the profundity. Oftentimes when I'm bringing this chapter into the classroom with my students, I'll ask them flat out, okay, so what does that mean? What's going on here? Let's first actually try to picture it in our minds. Picture Ahab leaning over the side of the ship, looking down into the water. And on the surface there, he sees his reflection. And this kind of has an echo of the story of Narcissus here as well. He sees his shadow. Now, the more that Ahab tries to figure out what it means, the more it goes down deeper and deeper into the water. And what is it doing as it does that? It's beckoning Ahab. If you want to try to figure me out, you're going to have to follow me. And where is that shadow going, that reflection? Into the chaos, into the den of the monsters. And so if Ahab wants to find out the ways of the world, the providential webs that connect everything, he's going to have to give up his life for it. It can only lead to his destruction. What I find interesting, I'm going to make a connection here to comics, because comics in a lot of ways tend to actually take religion the most more seriously than other forms of art, to be honest with you. There's a villain in the DC universe, is probably the best villain that most people have never heard of. His name is Vandal Savage. And what's fascinating about this villain is he was a Cro-Magnon man from thousands of years ago who was exposed to this special meteor. And what this meteor did was it gave him immortality. And it made it so that if he got, like stabbed or shot or anything like that, he would heal and be perfectly fine. What's fascinating about this villain, though, is because his basic power is immortality, essentially, what he does is he accrues knowledge. And the more knowledge that he accrues, the more godlike he becomes. This, of course, also connects back to this idea of the Garden of Eden, right? Eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and in the Miltonic sense, this idea that you'll become more godlike by gaining more knowledge. And in reality, all you get is this idea of mortality. So Vandal Savage is thousands and thousands and thousands of years old, and he just simply keeps accruing knowledge. One storyline that I find to be completely amazing comes from the DC animated universe, the Justice League, in which at the very beginning of this episode, Toyman, who's one of these villains, he shoots a laser ray at Superman, and it seems to disintegrate him completely, like Superman is just gone. What you come to learn is that Toyman actually can't destroy matter, right? This idea of the law of conservation. He ends up sending Superman 30,000 years into the future. Meanwhile, in the present, Vandal Savage, with Superman out of the way, Vandal Savage is actually able to basically destroy the world, which is what he believes he wants to do. All the knowledge that he's gained up to that point has told him, kind of like the misfit from Flannery O'Connor's A Good Man is Hard to Find. All that knowledge, all that it has done for him is to lead him to believe that the only thing left to do is to inflict pain and suffering on others. And so he will simply destroy anything that he sees in his way. And in some storylines, Vandal Savage was also Cain, which I thought was absolutely fascinating. Anyway, so Vandal Savage destroys the world. Move forward 30,000 years into the future where Superman is now. Superman finds Vandal Savage because he's an immortal. And Superman thinks that they're going to get into this amazing fight. And in reality, what happens is Vandal Savage tells him, Superman, it is so good to see you. I've been alone for 30,000 years, and I've had a lot of time to simply think without the noise of trying to gain more power. Because like in the episode with Dr. Dwayne Armitage that I have, we talked about the idea of the will to power with Nietzsche is predicated also on this idea of having to overcome something. And with nothing left to overcome in the future, Vandal Savage has no need to continually chase power. So all that's left is for Vandal Savage to just simply think and reflect. And what the idea that he comes to, or the answer, is to tell Superman, I'm going to do everything that I can to get you back to your present day time. And I'm going to give you all the information I can to help you stop me from doing what I'm going to do. Think about that for a second. Because oftentimes in the comic book realm, when you have a mad scientist type figure, like a Victor Frankenstein kind of thing, what will happen is when they actually do achieve their goal of gaining all knowledge in the universe, what I love about what comics do is they actually take the time to think about that philosophically. And I do think they're right. When the villain gains all knowledge, they quickly learn it doesn't matter. It's essentially meaningless. Knowing all things in no way puts you closer to humanity, to the things that we really need in order to thrive as human beings. So let me make my way back here now to Moby-Dick. Piercing the profundity is that chase to try to gain all knowledge, trying to gain divine knowledge. It's the Garden of Eden all over again. It's the idea of eating the apple, right? I think that there's a fascinating connection to that here when it says, the narrator tells us that Ahab cast his last cindered apple to the soil. That's the blighted fruit tree. The tree is a kind of stand-in, I think, there for the Garden of Eden and for also Ahab's decaying soul, of course, right? The dropping of that last apple is the destruction of the last vestige of Ahab's humanity. That's it. He's gone. He's done. The rest of this book really moves us toward Ahab's destruction. So you have this dark romantic notion of chasing knowledge. But the problem, and I talked about this with Dr. John Greenaway as well, because it's very Shelley, very Frankenstein-oriented here. The problem with piercing the profundity also is that you may gain the knowledge, the godlike knowledge, but what you lack is the theology. You lack the word, right? So Jesus is the word. And that word is not simply power. That word also gives story. It gives purpose. It gives power. It gives an understanding of why we are where we are. It gives us a glimpse into our being. Frankenstein's creature, and even Milton's Satan to a degree, are all looking for theology. They already are created beings, and they have a tremendous amount of knowledge. Ahab is incredibly intelligent, very intelligent. What they actually are looking for in this sense is theology. And you can't be the word. And that's kind of what they struggle with a little bit, right? Because think about the second half of this chapter. Is all Ahab asking these questions of why? Why? Why this? Why that? That's theology. That's the word. And that actually takes us into our third part here that I want to look at, which is Ahab's struggle for agency, where he starts to question. Here's the big, question. Is Ahab Ahab? Is it I, God, or who that lifts this arm? He wants to know, can I claim ownership over anything of my own? And here I'm going to bring Jung in again too, because I think Jung does a great job of kind of getting to the main point here. Here we go. In speaking of religion, I must make clear from the start what I mean by that term. Religion, as the Latin word denotes, is a careful and scrupulous observation of what Rudolf Otto aptly termed the numinosum, that is, a dynamic agency or effect not caused by an arbitrary act of will. On the contrary, and here's where Ahab kind of comes in, on the contrary, it seizes and controls the human subject, who is always rather its victim than its creator. And that's where Ahab feels at this moment. Ahab feels as though he is a victim and never the creator of his own will. He's completely falling under the chaos of trying to merge his creative will with the theology, with the word, and he can't do it. And it's making him lose his mind. I want to know, what am I actually in control of? And you could see how even a person of today could get trapped into that same idea. What exactly is within my control, right? This loss of control. Today we talk quite a bit about increased levels of anxiety, increased levels of depression, increased levels of just feeling a lack of control. And I think part of that has to do with this idea of trying to reconcile free will, trying to reconcile what exactly can I control. And so some people will obsess over one particular aspect of their life that they can control, and they will just stay there. They won't venture outside of it because they know that if they do, they will enter into a space of which they have very little control. Learning how to become comfortable within chaos, standing in a room of chaos and accepting what you can control and what you can't control, might be one of the biggest ways that we can bring down these increasing levels of anxiety and concern. But that takes a tremendous amount of reading and of reflection. And I'm not sure how much time we have today in between the amount of information through, media. When I say media, I mean things like movies, TV, social media, news media. We're bombarded with so much information that fills up our time. I'm not sure that we have enough time and space for the kind of reflection that's necessary to really understand how little we actually have control of in the world. And to be settled into that, to really lean into that concept. It's one of the concepts I try to teach my students, is to learn how to impose order on chaos by first being in the chaos. Be comfortable in it. Learn around you what you can and you can't control, and move into the places where you can impose a bit of order here. But first, be comfortable in it. So, what I want us to take away from this look, is this idea of it's not as difficult as you might think for us to become trapped in this kind of space like Ahab, to have problems with our agency, to feel as though we have been outcast from the world. And even this idea of chasing knowledge that will clearly lead to our destruction, right? How many times are people chasing either love or chasing extreme positions, extreme groups? All of that is this idea of trying to pierce the profundity, or the exorbitant amount of people who are chasing conspiracies even, or cults, or all these different things. These all come out of a similar understanding of what Ahab is going through here. It's this lack of forgiveness of the self, this inability to, I would say, accept the forgiveness of others as well, right? Like that heir idea, the stepmother world is trying to bring him back in. Ahab merely needs to take that step and forgive himself and be forgiven. And to understand that we're not simply in control of everything. I think this is an incredible lesson for us to learn. Now, I implore everybody to take a couple of weeks and read this novel, but I will give a bit of a warning about reading Moby-Dick. Most of the time, what happens is people will start reading it and they'll get through the first 15 to 20 chapters and they'll be like, oh, wow, no wonder this is a classic. It's amazing. It's awesome. Really exciting. And then what happens is they'll start reading chapters where Melville goes through the cetology or the anatomy of a whale, or he'll start talking about things that happen on a ship, and people will start to feel bored. What I'll tell you is this. One, try to really focus on those chapters more than even the others, because oftentimes what Melville is doing in those chapters is setting up our mindset to better engage those other chapters where more of the plot take place. So really lean into those. The other thing I'll say is push through. Do not stop on those chapters. Push through so that you can get to the end, because the ending of the novel, when you finish it, you feel like you've gone through an existential journey, a quest kind of. So if you've never read Moby-Dick, I highly recommend that you do so. And I hope you enjoyed our little quest here as well. Until next time, try to keep one foot firmly planted on neutral ground. And have a great day.